Yes, folks, that's right. Bring an open mind to an open canvas. Again, that is Monday nights, 10 p.m. Eastern. UFOs to government corruption. This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here. All right. Thanks for listening while we take that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And yeah, we're going to get back to your host.
Greetings and welcome to the Morningstar Report. So I'm about to welcome my special guest, Barbara Honegger, who is a scholar and an author. And this is a very important day. I'm going to read you a little bit of something. Headline story from the New York Times. 43-year secret sabotage mission to subvert Carter is revealed. It's a cover story by Peter Baker. Washington, it has been more than 4 decades. But Ben Barnes said he remembered it vividly. His longtime political mentor invited him on a mission to the Middle East. What Mr. Barnes said, he did not realize until later the real purpose of the mission, which was to sabotage the re-election campaign of President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. Well, folks, it's sad. I mentioned in the earlier part of the program that President Carter is in his last days on Earth. And it seems that the political tsunami that has hit Washington has actually washed across the East Coast and cleaned up the New York Times enough for them to come out and tell the people the truth. Goodness. 1980 to 2022. My math is right. That's 52 years. It took them 52 years to tell the people the truth about the campaign to sabotage Jimmy Carter's re-election campaign by none other than George H.W. Bush, a nefarious figure in American history. And I'm really honored to have as my guest the first person to tell the world about it. Her name is Barbara Honegger. She was an assistant to President Reagan. She was intimately involved in the events surrounding the attempted assassination of President Reagan. You will recall a couple of weeks ago, we did a wonderful program called Remembering the Gipper. And Barbara contacted me about this headline story, and we're going to talk about her book, October Surprise. So, Barbara Honegger, welcome to the program. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Robert.
Hi.
I'm very excited today. You can imagine.
I can imagine. You know, you've waited 52
years, by the way, not 52.
Oh, well, 52 since it happened, and 42 since you told the world. And as I understand it, somebody else took that title and wrote another book about it. Is that correct?
Okay.
Yeah.
So your question was what about a book? I'm sorry.
Oh, I understand. Wasn't there another book called October Surprise? They tried to hijack your title?
Yes. Well, mine was the first by almost 3 years before Navy intelligence Captain Gary Sick wrote a book by the same title. And basically, I don't know if stole is the right word, but he didn't even mention my book. And 90% of everything in my book, he just put in his book, didn't mention mine. And the most important thing about Gary Sick's book, which is the only one mentioned in the cover story in the page A1 of the New York Times today by Peter Baker, about this new revelation on the October surprise, the evidence supporting the October surprise today in the New York Times, Sunday New York Times. What Gary Sick did was he intentionally, in my opinion, diverted attention from George H.W. Bush Sr.'s critical involvement in the key Paris meeting before the 1980 election to sabotage Carter's attempts to bring the hostages home, and instead focused 100% of the attention effectively on William Casey. And my book focuses on both Casey and George Bush Sr.
Okay, let's go back to the very beginning. As I mentioned, You were working in the Reagan White House, and people can go into the archives and look up that program, which we did, I believe, 3 weeks ago. Uh, the, Remembering the Gipper. You can also find an article on Substack, where Robert Morningstar.substack.com, where the Morningstar Report newsletter is published regularly. But I want to go back now to Barbara's first inkling or discovery. How did you learn about this secret mission to sabotage Jimmy Carter's presidency? But folks, at the time that Jimmy Carter was running for his second term, Ayatollah Khomeini and the radical jihadis, Shias, had taken over the embassy and had been holding the American embassy staff and Americans hostage for a very long time. Actually, it was about a year. I remember that when Reagan was inaugurated, the headline of the New York Times said, Reagan inaugurated, Iran releases hostages 444 days after taking them. So that's stuck in my mind, that numerology. But let me ask Barbara. Barbara, when did you learn about this and
Well,
write the book?
yes. Um, by the way, I've sent you the cover of my book, October Surprise, in case you could put that up on the screen at some point or in your Substack article about this show. And
Okay.
it's available on Amazon. It's called October Surprise. It was published on May 12th of 1989. And the very day, I will answer your question, but I just want people to know about my book because that's what really matters. Um, so on the day my book was published, May 12th, 1989, Bush had just recently become president of the United States on January 20th, 1989. And on that day, he had uh, his
His
Department of
part.
he had his Department of Justice sue one of my chief sources in my book, October Surprise, for allegedly lying in what is in my book, October Surprise. So, President George Bush Sr., the day my book was published, he knew it was about to come out. He tried to discredit it by suing one of my chief sources. And so he literally made a federal case out of my book, October Surprise. And almost exactly a year later, on May 4th, 1990, that source for my book, one of them, just one of them, Richard Brennicke, who was a covert operator for the deep state, Richard Brennicke was acquitted by the federal court in Portland, Oregon, of all 60 counts. And it was headlines around the world that George Bush, the President of the United States, lost that case, that the jury understood that the October surprise was true. Okay, so to answer your question, it's all in my book, what I'm about to tell you, in particular, the first two chapters of the book. But the bottom line is that I was at a very high level in the 1980 Reagan Bush campaign. I was at a high enough level that there was something called the Operations Center at campaign headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. This is the Reagan Bush Sr. 1980 Republican campaign through the presidency and vice presidency. And I was at a level where I had the secret code to get on the buttons, to press the buttons in the door to go into the Operations Center. And I knew, because I was the chief aide to the chief domestic policy advisor to then presidential candidate Ronald Reagan, I knew that our campaign was paranoid that Carter would bring the hostages home because we had learned from a highly technical, hugely expensive set of um, what are called focus groups around the country. We had learned that if the hostages were brought home by Carter between October 18th and 25th, that he would win the election, even though Reagan was ahead by at least 7 points at that time. So if Carter brought the hostages home before that, Reagan would win. If he brought them home after the 25th of October, uh, Reagan would win. So what happened was on October 18th or 19th, I went into the operations center at the campaign headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. And up until that point, everybody was who were in there, and basically this was the Bush side people um, worked out of the back room there. There was a guy by the name of Stephen Halper, uh, who was uh, a son-in-law of Ray Klein, who was a top covert operative for George H.W. Bush. And so when I went in to the operations center, suddenly, instead of people being all tense and worried, there was a celebration going on. I went up to a couple of people and I said, what's going on? And they said, you mean you don't know? And I said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, we don't have to worry about an October surprise, meaning we don't have to worry any longer about Carter being able to bring the hostages home in the critical October 18th to 25th window, which we already knew from our focus group, from our focus group research, would ensure the election to Carter. And of course, he was trying to bring the hostages home for almost a year, as you said. So I had that personal experience. But frankly, I wasn't sure what it meant, and I had a job to do. So years went by, and it wasn't until the very first inklings of Iran Contra came out that, if for those who might recall it, Ed Meese, who was then, I believe Meese was then, at that point, he was either attorney general, or prior to that, in the first Reagan administration, he had been the chief attorney for the president, the counselor to the president in the White House. But regardless of his position, it was Ed Meese who went public in late 1986 on national television saying that, you know, we're going to come clean here, and there was some arms sales to Iran, and the Israelis were the middlemen, and they hyped up the price to Iran, and the profits went to fund the Contras. Well, that was just a cover story. It was a cover story because the arms to Iran, at least $5 billion worth of them, had been promised to the Khomeini regime by the Reagan-Bush campaign in the persons of George H.W. Bush, then vice presidential running mate to Ronald Reagan, and William Casey, who was the campaign manager for Reagan and Bush Sr. in 1980. They had cut this deal with the Khomeini regime, with representatives of the Ayatollah Khomeini himself, to delay the release of the hostages, to ensure Carter lost, and then in exchange for billions of dollars of arms that actually did flow secretly and illegally, at least 2 billion of them out of the United States arms stores, armories, with the Israelis being the pilots. And that was on the front page of the New York Times by Cy Hirsch, by the way.
Yes.
So the October surprise is real. And when Ed Meese went on national television in late 1986 and had this Iran-Contra cover story, they wanted you to believe that, oh, there were only about $150 million worth of unimportant arms that were, flown into Iran by the Israeli middleman in the mid-1980s. That was just the cover story, the very tip of the iceberg of the arms sales that had been promised, billions and billions of them, by the 1980 Reagan-Bush campaign to sabotage Carter's presidential re-election. So when Meese said that, the connection happened. The bells went off in my head, and I was dedicated to uncovering the truth about the October surprise and doing my book. By the way, my book October Surprise, which was just on the screen, is available on Amazon. It was published in May of 1989, and it was on the cover of Publishers Weekly. It was also the book of the month in all of the then Walden bookstores, about 1,000 of them across the United States. They were in huge pyramids in the front of all of the 1,000 or so Walden bookstores. The Walden bookstores were kind of like Barnes and Noble today. They're no longer in business. And there were huge posters of the cover of my book in all of the windows across the country. So It's not as if the October surprise hasn't been known. And then about 3 years after my book was published, Gary Sick, who was he was with Naval Intelligence, and he had been not only President Carter's, but he had been Gerald Ford, President Carter's, and then after Reagan and Bush took the White House because of this sabotage of Carter, he stayed on for a while in the National Security Council in the West Wing of the White House as first Ford's, then Carter's, and then Reagan and Bush's chief Iran expert throughout the entire hostage crisis under Carter. And he published a book by the same title as mine after mine had basically run its print run. There were about 50,000 copies of my book that were published.
Barbara, Barbara, let me get something straight.
Yeah.
You revealed this, the Iran-Contra scheme was extremely convoluted. And I was wondering, how the hell did Nicaragua get into the mix? But what you're telling me now is that they made a secret deal with Iran, our enemy, who had been holding our hostages, was carrying out terrorist attacks against us. And we agreed to supply them with arms, weapons, munitions, at the same time that we were supplying Saddam Hussein, because Iran and Iraq got involved in an 8-year-long war.
No, that's correct. The Iran-Iraq war had already been going on for over a year.
And that's when we gave weapons of mass destruction to Saddam Hussein.
That's right.
Which is the irony that the deep state kept denying that they had given it. And it was paramount when the invasion of Iraq occurred in the first Gulf War. One of the main thrusts of the Army's goal was to capture all those weapons, basically chemical weapons that Saddam Hussein had used against the Iranians. Million people died, million or more died in those wars. But this shows you the duplicity of the deep state. I'm not going to say the United States because we are the United States, but the deep state is a very sinister cabal of war hawks that believes in perpetual warfare as a way of keeping the economy going, which is the reason now for Ukraine and why they want to push us into war with Russia. But this just shows you the double dealing, duplicity, and the lying nature of the deep state, that while we were ostensibly at war with Iran or opposing them, we were feeding them weapons. That is incredible. That's an amazing.
That's correct. And by the way, at the beginning of the show, you mentioned that the headline in the New York Times.
Yes.
Way back on the day that the hostages were released, which was literally the day that Reagan and Sr. took the oath of office, January 20th, 1981. But what the New York Times didn't mention is that the Iranians were waiting with walkie-talkies. All of the hostages were in the plane, well, except for one, and that's another story. They held back one of them as collateral, but we could go into that later. But 52 hostages. There was actually a 53rd hostage, but 52 hostages were on the plane, on the airport, on the tarmac in Tehran, and there was an Iranian there with a walkie-talkie waiting for a call that George Bush Sr. had just taken the oath as vice president, and then the plane was allowed to leave.
That's amazing. Now, let me ask you. I've heard that George Bush made the flight to Paris secretly, covertly in an SR-71 Blackbird. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, I know a lot about that, and that was a lie by a man by the name of Gunther Russbacher. And Gunther Russbacher was married to a woman who, unfortunately, at the time was someone that I knew here in the Monterey Peninsula, where I wrote my book, October Surprise. And he was in prison, in jail and prison. I won't go into why. When my book came out, and she asked me for a copy. I got a few extra copies. And she sent it to him in prison. And he read it, and he started going on radio shows, making that absurd claim. beginning after he got my book October Surprise and read it. He was a con man. He was trying to basically gray mail the government to get him out of jail, and he was eventually sent back to Austria. So, and by the way, Ross Perot, in the lead up to the 19 let's see, it would have been the 1994 election when Bush was running against Dukakis. That's when Gunther Rustbacher made these claims all over radio, and the radio talk show hosts would have me on right afterwards to rebut his claims with true evidence. But my point is that when Bush ran to try to get reelected,
Right.
whoever he was running against, that's when Ross Perot, that's when Gunther Rustbacher was in prison, I believe in Texas, wherever it was at the time. He was moved around to different prisons.
Oh, you're
And
right.
he was
That's 92. You're correct.
92,
Yeah.
and Ross Perot went to that prison with an SR-71 pilot. And they interrogated him, and they came out, and the SR-71 pilot said he doesn't know what he's talking about. So I don't want to give any credence to this person in that claim.
So do you know how Bush did get to Paris, where he?
Well, we know that he got there, and that evidence is in my book October Surprise. Not on an SR-71, I don't believe, but even if it was, Gunther Rustbacher wasn't the pilot. Okay. But anyway, he came into Le Bourget Airport. He was seen there. And one of the most interesting facts about the October Surprise is that after my book came out, and then almost 3 years later, sixth book by the same title, Gary's sixth book by the same title, October Surprise, came out. His having been Carter's chief Iran expert throughout the hostage crisis, confirming the essence of my book, October Surprise. When that happened, then the House of Representatives, then controlled by the Democrats, voted a House October Surprise task force that was funded at a level higher than the 9/11 Commission after the 9/11 attack, believe it or not. Oh. And when that happened, let's see, what was I going to tell you about that? When that happened,
well, let me ask you, did they ask you to testify?
When that happened, Gunther Rustbacher was removed from the country, and so that he couldn't talk any longer, and he was sent to Austria. He was basically a Nazi.
Another one. I'll just say another one. Was he one of the original paperclip Nazis? Is that was he there that long?
He could have been. I'm not certain. He could have been. But anyway, so Bush could. Oh, that's what I was going to tell you. Okay, so when that happened, when the October Surprise House Task Force started, and it was obvious that the Democrats were going to really go for the jugular of this incredible treason. This was high treason by the man who was then President of the United States. And so when the House October Surprise Task Force began, or just before it began, and it was clear it was going to happen, believe it or not, we now know that George Bush Jr., who was president during, of course, the second Iraq War,
yes,
his father being, the president at the time of the first Gulf War, the first Iraq War, then his son, the second Gulf War, starting in 2003. At that time, George Bush Jr. offered to his father to go public and say that he, George Bush Jr., was the George Bush who had flown to Paris to cut the deal.
Wow, that family really lives by the big lie. That act of treason was one of many acts of treason that George H.W. Bush did, yeah. Not the least of which was recruiting the killers and shooters of President Kennedy and organizing the Bay of Pigs invasion and continuing attacks on Cuba from his oil platforms, the Zapata Oil Company, even after President Kennedy had told Khrushchev that he would cease and desist trying to overthrow Castro. George Bush and Operation 40 continued to attack Cuba, blow up Hess Oil Refinery, kill policemen, set fire to sugarcane fields, and making President Kennedy look like a liar in the face of the Russians. So at that time, President Kennedy swore he was going to destroy the CIA, and he set the FBI to arrest these rogue elements of the CIA. So George Bush was actually on the run. President Kennedy had sicked the FBI on the CIA rogues, and they were looking for him. So but Lyndon Johnson, who was going to be indicted for great corruption, and on November 22nd, Lyndon Johnson was scheduled to be impeached at 2 o'clock in the afternoon by the U.S. Senate. So he had to become president before 1 o'clock, when President Kennedy was scheduled to give a speech that would have changed the history of the world. If President Kennedy had been allowed to speak at the Dallas Trade Mart, the speech he had in hand would have changed the whole history of the world, and we would not
I
be.
believe the text of that speech is on your Substack page.
Yes, it was the first Substack article that I wrote. It was published on his birthday, and I delivered that speech here on Revolution Radio in the hope that that speech, its words going out to the general public, could reorient our course on the wrong track of history.
Well,
But
by the way, if it's okay, I'd like to remind people what triggered this show today. And
yes,
that is that on the front page of the New York edition, now I still have to go down the hill and get my national edition of the New York Times today.
well, I
And
got a copy of the New York edition right here.
yes, I know, I asked you to get that. And thank you for mailing me just the A1 first section. That's the only part I'd like you to mail to me. But
Okay.
what I wanted to say is that the reason for the trigger for doing this today is that on the front page of the New York edition, could also be on the national edition. I will find that out later today when I go down the hill to get my copy. I cannot get the New York edition here in California, but I do know that because you got it for me, I
Yep.
alerted you last night that the New York edition today has on page A1, banner headline story, a new revelation by an insider who was personally involved in a number of meetings with top um, presidents and prime ministers in the Middle East
Mhm.
to attempt to sabotage Carter's reelection to prevent him from getting the hostages released. So that's on the banner headline story on page A1, the front page of the New York Times today. So that's the reason for the trigger. But what I'd like to say for having this show today, what I want to say about that is that this article, which hopefully you'll be able to give the link to on the screen and also on your Substack page, Robert,
Mhm.
um, this article is just the bare tip of the iceberg. In order to, all it does is um, the important thing is that it's the mainstream media, the so-called paper of record of the United States on the front page, basically saying, look, people, the October surprise actually happened. And here's the latest whistleblower. But the New York Times never did anything like this for all these years. That all of my book and Gary Sick's book and Robert Perry's book on the October surprise called Trick or Treason, the October Surprise Mystery, or Ari Ben Menashe's book on the October surprise called Prophets of War, from the inside of the Israeli IDF, because he was personally involved in the negotiations on the Israeli side.
Mhm.
None of this ever made the New York Times, and until today. It actually came out in the online edition of the New York Times last night, which is how I knew to alert you to get the New York edition today. Um, so people need to read these books. Start with mine, then go to Gary Sick's, then go to Robert Perry's, which is called Trick or Treason, the October Surprise Mystery. These are all on Amazon.com. Then go to Ari Ben Menashe, Prophets of War, and be sure to go to a website that Bob Perry, when he was alive, he's no longer with us, unfortunately, but his website is consortiumnews.com. That's consortium news, plural, with an s.com. And when you get there, just look for put in the search field for the October surprise, for all of Bob Perry's articles that were published even after our 4 books were published, and in particular for his series of documents that were leaked out of the congressional investigation. The House October Surprise Task Force leaked Bob Perry, and he's published them on his website proving the October surprise, and that's called the October Surprise X Files on consortiumnews.com. The October surprise happened, and it was the highest imaginable treason, because people need to understand that George Bush Sr. and William Casey, who became CIA director, he was campaign manager for Bush Sr. and Reagan in 1980, and he became, of course, um, Reagan and Bush Sr.'s CIA director in order to carry out the October surprise deal covertly and secretly and treasonously with the Khomeini regime, in exchange for the release of the hostages and ensuring that they would not release them to Carter. Okay, so this high treason resulted in another over a month from October 18th and 19th, 1980, when the final Paris meeting with George Bush Sr. and William Casey took place in Paris, France, until January 20th, 1981. Do the math. So you're talking what, about 3 months? An additional 3 months in which at least 52 to 53 Americans were held hostage in Iran, some of them in even prison, being tortured. And this is who was President of the United States when I published my book, October Surprise.
Yes, indeed. I had to mute my mic because a wacky driver was blasting his horn
Well,
in the background.
Shark, what do you expect?
Yeah, well, that's why the alternate name of my program is The Sounds of New York City News, because we have the fire engines, the police department, the EMS, and for some reason, tractor trailer drivers like to make this turn on 92nd Street. It's very inviting. They'll be going up Broadway and see the traffic, and then they'll just cut up my street.
I'd like to
747.
tell you and your listeners another incredible fact,
Yes.
and that is, this is in the very end of my book, October Surprise, and that is on August 8th of 1988. Now this is before my book was published, so I was able to put it in my book later. But on on August 8th of 1988, so that's 8/8/88. Very interesting.
Yes.
On that date, the Ayatollah Khomeini declared a ceasefire in the Iran-Iraq War. It ended. And I was watching, as I did every single night, because many people may have forgotten that ABC's Nightline with Ted Koppel was started because of the hostage crisis. And every night, Koppel would say, "Okay, it's now day 12 of the hostage crisis," and the very last day was day 444 when they were finally released. But then Nightline continued after that, and so on. I was watching Nightline on the night live on the night of August 8th, 1988, when Koppel announced that Khomeini, in a surprise move, had said that he was taking the poison pill and that he was declaring a ceasefire, an armistice in the Iran-Iraq War. And it did cease then. The hostilities, the military hostilities ceased. The moment Nightline ended, my phone rang. And it was the former president of Iran, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, who was calling me from Versailles. He was no longer in Iran because the Khomeini regime tried to kill him because of his attempts to work with Carter instead of Reagan. He tried to prevent the October surprise from happening. So he had to flee, and he was then living in exile in Versailles outside of Paris, France. And so I got a call from his assistant saying, "Is this Barbara Honegger?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "President Bani Sadr will come on the phone with you shortly." And he did. And President Bani Sadr, to my amazement, he thanked me for ending the Iran-Iraq War. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, he said, it is because of what you started. And by the way, he was one of my main sources in my book. We had worked together hand in glove. And I had visited him at his home in Versailles with a personal videotaped or audio taped interview, a very long interview. It was the good part of my research for the book October Surprise. So he said, well, what happened is, he said, because of your work and because you've gone public, he said that on a ship, representatives of the Khomeini regime and the Bush presidency, George H.W. Bush, I believe he said Bush was on the ship himself, but I can't remember. It's in my book, at the end of my book. But he said Bush basically read the riot act to Khomeini's representative. And he said, if you don't end the Iran-Iraq war, the October surprise is going to explode in all of our faces, and you will go down, and my administration will go down. And so Khomeini took the poison pill, and it wasn't long after that he died. Probably not by natural means.
Yeah. Well, I've got a story about Ayatollah Khomeini to tell you. As you know, I'm a remote viewer, and sometime in the early 1990s, I had this horrible dream that I was on a boat, and the boat was taken over by terrorists, and they were causing mayhem. They were killing people left and right, and I was evading them. I was going from one deck to another. I saw where they were going, and they're killing people, and I was helpless. The only thing I could do was survive. And I would race from one deck down to the lower deck, and then to the bow, and then to the stern, always evading these murderous gangs. And then I decided, holy mackerel, the only way to end this is to jump ship. So I went to the stern of the ship. And when I got to the stern of the ship, I saw this black shape hovering over the ship. And it was the black shape of Ayatollah Khomeini having left this portal open. And the evil that he had released was radiating, and that radiation, evil coming from this void space, a black space, was radiating, and it was directing all the terrorists to continue the murder and the mayhem. So what I did, I saw the shore, and I jumped off, and I swam for shore, and then the ship was going off out of control, but all the killing and the mayhem was still going on. So I told my friend, a friend of mine back in the 1990s, I told her about this vision, and she said, wow, do you know about how Ayatollah Khomeini, when Ayatollah Khomeini died, what happened? I said, what do you mean what happened? Do you know what happened to his body? She said, no, what happened to his body? She said, it dissolved. I said, what are you talking about? She said, Robert, there was such mania and insanity in Iran when he died that everyone wanted to touch his body. They were carrying it through the crowd on a pallet, and everyone was going and tearing and touching, and they ripped every piece of fabric off his body. Then they kept touching it, and it turned to mush, it turned to blood. Everything disappeared, including the bones. There was nothing of his body left to bury.
Are you serious?
I'm serious.
Now, how did she know that? Because the New York Times and such, not that they're, always reliable, but the New York Times said that his body was in a shipping container.
No, I had seen it. I saw the original videotape of his body exposed being carried. Well, the shipping container is probably where they put the bloody rags and whatever was left of him.
My God.
But yeah, that was, and the mania. I saw films of it, and I saw the insanity, the grief that was going through the crowd, because he really had established himself as I won't hesitate to say, a demonic demigod.
At the cemetery, the authorities appeared to have lost control of the crowd. They were trying to clear a space for the helicopter, which was now carrying the Ayatollah's body, landing almost amidst the mourners. As it touched down, the crowd tried to tear off the shroud that covered the Ayatollah. In the scuffles that followed, the body tipped out of the coffin nearly fell off the back of the vehicle carrying it away.
In their psyche.
Yeah.
And so that's how my dream revealed what happened. He just dissolved, but his evil is still radiating out of that portal that he opened.
That's absolutely incredible experience, which is similar to when JFK's ghost appeared to you the day Reagan was shot.
That's right. That's another thing that Barbara and I have bonded as soul brother and soul sister because we both went through miracles on the day that Ronald Reagan was shot. And mine was a life-altering experience where literally JFK's ghost outraged that Bush was out trying to kill another president of the United States and used the same tactic, lone gunman, et cetera, et cetera. He literally came out of the grave to warn me and to show me, to imprint on my mind, my body, my soul, what I would need to know 14 years later to crack the case. And I'm glad you've mentioned it because, folks, I want you to stay tuned to Revolution Radio because over the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be making more reports on the JFK assassination. We now have the documents in hand that prove that it was the CIA, the military intelligence industrial complex, that plotted his assassination for many months, from March through November 14th. There were weekly meetings held at the CIA, and George Bush was the principal recruiter of the assassins, the mafia. The mafia was going to be the fall guy. If they didn't get Lee Harvey Oswald as the patsy, they were going to say it was the mafia, which eventually did come to light. House Select Committee on Assassinations did a very in-depth investigation, which was blocked by the CIA in many cases, still locking up many of the files that are still locked up. And I have to say, the greatest mistake that Donald Trump ever made in his presidency was not releasing all of the JFK assassination material. He broke the law. There was a law. I blame his predicament today on his having failed to release all of the documents and having listened to Pompeo, who was then directing CIA, who begged him not to release the files. But folks,
by the way, when Trump announced that he was not, what he said was, well, I've seen some of these documents, and having seen them, I don't think the American public should ever be allowed to see them. However, we have those documents, and yes, you are going to be going public with them, and a very, very critical interview in the very near future that will blow the whole thing wide open.
Exactly. Well, I did make a report when I got the documents. I made a report 2 weeks ago where I gave a synopsis, and I'll give it again right now. When President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy interfered with the Pentagon's plans to invade Cuba and eliminate Castro, which surely would have led to nuclear war, because unbeknownst to the Pentagon, Nikita Khrushchev had delegated the use of tactical nuclear weapons to his field commander in Cuba. And he told him, Nikita Khrushchev told his field commander, if the Americans try to make a landing on Cuba, like they did on D-Day in Normandy, you are to use the Luna missiles and destroy the American fleet and the American forces. So the Pentagon was banking on the idea that only Khrushchev could directly allow the use of nuclear weapons. And because of the hierarchy and the chain of command of the Soviets, they thought that they would never have time to do it. But Khrushchev, remember, Khrushchev was the man who beat the Nazis at Stalingrad. Khrushchev was the political commissar in charge of Stalingrad, and he beat the Nazis. And it's really telling President Kennedy was somewhat naive. He was hopeful of making a breakthrough in the Cold War and attaining peace. And when he met Khrushchev in Vienna, in 1961, he tried to convince him of the good intentions of the United States government. And Khrushchev turned to him and said, "How can I believe you when I see the same Nazi generals that I faced at Stalingrad? I see the same Nazi generals in charge of NATO forces on the other side of the Berlin Wall." And Kennedy was left speechless. But
It's true. It was
it
true.
is absolutely true. And NATO, Nazis, look at the mess. Look at the mess that NATO has made of the world and made of Europe. The Ukraine war need not have happened. It was NATO and the deep state that kept prodding Zelensky, an arrogant, prideful, cocaine crazy comedian, a puppet who was a stooge, who was put in that position, who is not even Ukrainian. Zelensky is not Ukrainian. He was born in Russia and he was raised in Mongolia, where Genghis Khan is the hero. So the biggest mess that we have seen since World War II was created by NATO. And as I said on this program many times, even the Pope has to tell the truth sometimes. And the Pope said, NATO caused this war by barking at Putin's door. And that, in a nutshell, is the truth. Also, if you go to robertmorningstar.substack.com, read my latest article, Setting Things Straight on the Ukraine War, what you need to know. And what you need to know is that a genocide had been conducted, was being conducted, and a greater one being planned by Zelensky and the Azov Nazi brigades. And they had killed 14,000 people, both Russians and Ukrainians, in the Donbass region. And they were getting ready for a complete onslaught. So aside from the fact that the Pentagon and Pfizer and Biden and Obama had paid for 46, not 30, but 46 bioweapons laboratories, gain of function laboratories along the borders of Ukraine, or the border with Russia, they were planning a genocidal attack on the Donbass. And so Putin declared a special military operation. But Putin is a very smart man. He's very tactful. He knows the law. And what Putin did was he went before the United Nations and he invoked Article 51, which is the right for individual and collective self-defense. And he told the United Nations, this is a threat to Russia. It is an existential threat. And they are also killing Russians. And they have killed 14,000 of them. And now they're planning to kill even more. And so I invoke Article 51, the right of any nation to defend itself. And that's what he did. And the media here is keeping that away from the public eye.
And he also invoked the UN Charter to require representatives from all of the nations of the UN, or at least the Security Council nations, to meet in Europe to receive the evidence of those 46 bioweapons labs. And they did that.
Yeah, they did that. They also presented it in the Security Council, but the Mockingbird media here hasn't uttered a word about it because they are on the listen, Democrats always try to solve the nation's problems, political problems they have at home. They always try to start a war. They think that starting a war cranks up the economy. They're talking about winning a tactical nuclear war. There's no such thing as winning a nuclear war of any kind, because the tactical nuclear war will escalate into a strategic nuclear war.
The good news is the Chinese know that, and the president of China is doing his best to prevent that from happening.
Exactly. And so, folks, I urge you, people say, how can we stop it? they want to make you think that you are powerless, that you are impotent. But those politicians respond to public pressure. You've got that computer in front of you, you have an email, you have Twitter. A guy said to me, "What can we do?" I said, "Listen, friend, I contacted every single member of Congress through Twitter. I sent them important video evidence and documentation about the SVB Bank, for example. The SVB Bank did not collapse from mismanagement. They just took the money and ran because the SVB Bank was a money laundering operation for the drug cartels. The Mexican drug cartels were depositing the money in the SVB Bank, and the SVB Bank was transferring it to New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, there's a man named Mike Gill that he came on the wrong side of the New Hampshire mafia, and they tried to destroy him. And they actually made him lose $300 million, but he still had $400 million to fight back. And he has exposed 3 officials in the New Hampshire government as frontmen for the Boston, what do they call it? It's a Boston bank that's a central hub of this network for money laundering. So they knew that this investigation, criminal investigation into SVB was coming, and they pulled all the money out. And on the day before they announced the collapse of the bank, the CEOs and executives of SVB gave themselves $1 million bonuses, and they literally took the money and ran. You have to go to Forbidden Knowledge TV. Alexandra Bruce has produced a fantastic documentary and a report on it. And I read some of it on Chicago radio. And you have to apprise yourself of the real situation. So now Biden is in deep trouble because of this investigation into the Hunter Biden laptop. And the 2 things that he wants to do is wag the dog, as they say, start a war or get more involved in the war in Europe against Russia, and arrest Donald Trump, indict him, convict him. And if you have a conviction for a felony, you can't run for president of the United States. I'll let Barbara finish up.
Donald Trump is not going to be arrested.
Right. That's
right. His attorneys have announced that he's going to, if he is in fact told he's indicted, that he will voluntarily surrender to the process. But he will almost certainly be out on bail and back at Mar-a-Lago.
That's right. Or he could stay in Florida and wait for extradition proceedings to proceed, and I doubt that.
But he's not. He's not going to be.
No. He's going to play this up, play it to the hilt, and I don't think they're going to find 12 people in New York State or New York City that will convict him for paying hush money to Stormy Daniels. And I don't know if you heard the first part of the program, but I discussed Alvin Bragg's response and the details of what they're trying to pin on him, which is that he made an illegal contribution to his campaign fund, presidential campaign fund. But I said, if the hush money to Stormy Daniels was to protect his presidential campaign, then his paying back Michael Cohen for the job was a legal contribution to his presidential campaign. I call this whole thing a kangaroo court and a clown show. So let's see what happens, folks.
We just have to see what will happen.
Exactly.
The government does not want, no matter what Bragg does, the government, neither Bragg nor the government want to inflame the situation because Donald Trump will take advantage of it. You know, they're gonna play it low key.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he issued a kind of scaredy cat announcement to his staff about how they're going to enforce the law, not be afraid of anyone. But it was very conciliatory in regard to Trump. And so I guess they were in contact, the lawyers were in contact. So Trump is not going to have the 6 o'clock in the morning knock on the door with people barging in with guns and catching him in his underwear. He's too smart for that. And, you know, he's a showman.
Well, the government's now too smart for that because they did that in Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah,
with the FBI, and it backfired on them.
that's right. And folks, you know, I have to tell you, I think that the deep state is the greatest threat to America today. It's not Russia. It's not China. It's the deep state. Well, folks, I'm hearing the dulcet tones of the break music for Revolution Radio. Please contribute to Revolution Radio so we can keep the torrent of truth going. And I want to thank my friend, my soul sister, Barbara, for being program next week. Tune in tomorrow. I assume you'll be at 10 o'clock for UFOs.
You're listening to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.